Feeling inspired.
Friday afternoon, you don't have to lie.
Not the easiest session to chair, but I personally feel like I've been here for a month, but I'm still energized, and I hope we can continue to inspire you for the next 1 hour and a half. So my name is Burnett Stuart. I work at UNICRI. It's a UN agency that focuses on crime prevention and criminal justice. I'm personally interested in climate security because I work on a project with the climate security advisor of the UN in West Africa and the Sahel, looking at the linkages between conflict and violent extremism. But I'm very happy that I was asked to chair this session with 3 excellent speakers and very interesting presentations. I don't believe we came up with the title for the session. It was given to us, Institutionalizing the Climate Security Nexus, but I think it's apt and reflects what will be discussed. And I think for me, the key question is what happens when we mainstream certain discourses around climate and security into key institutions, international institutions, regional, down to the local ones. Maybe before we kick off, just to frame, I mean, in terms of the UN, for example, the first time that the relationship between climate change and security was actually talked about at the UN was in 2007. And since then, there have been several resolutions and presidential statements. In 2018, the Climate Security Mechanism, the joint initiative between UNDP, UNDP, and UNEP was established. And in the space really of 2-3 years, starting from 2020-21, I think that's when the first climate security advisor was appointed in Somalia. I think now we have 8 or 9 at the end of the year. So the pace the pace of how the climate security nexus has become institutionalized has been remarkable. And of course, the EU first framed climate change as a security risk in 2003. And now the strategic compass called for mainstreaming climate security and civilian crisis management, including through deployment environmental advisors in all civilian defense missions. And we have similar examples with the US, of course, and NATO, we know, has a climate security center of excellence as well now. But that's enough from me. Which given away, but we will start. So the way that we will operate, I think we will have 10-15 minutes presentation each, and then we will have time for a Q&A session. So without further ado, let me start with Silvia Danielak. So Silvia is an assistant professor at Carter School for Peace and Conflict Resolution, George Mason University. And her research focuses on social spatial planning in the context of conflict and disaster risk, specifically researching the role of infrastructure in conflict actions. Over to you, Silvia.
Thank you very much. I was like worried that you would talk more and then we don't have anything to say anymore. So let's get started. So I'll be taking you to the world of peacekeeping. And I think humanitarian issues have come up a bit already in the last days. So we'll dive into this a bit more now. Now, as you might know or might actually not know, infrastructure building has been part of operations for a very long time. And what I'm going to present you today is kind of bringing this to the present and looking at what's happening currently with infrastructure building. But it's part of a book that is forthcoming that looks at the entire history of infrastructure building and peacekeeping. And so I can say that since the 1960s, since the UN has been involved in the very first civil wars in Cyprus and in the Congo, they have been building infrastructure in the places they intervened. So they have been building roads and dams and water towers, wells, of course, their own camps. And now over the years, we've seen more and more ambitious projects, solar panels, urban lighting, healthcare centers, markets, etc. And despite this evidence of peacekeepers building infrastructure, in the discourse, infrastructure is predominantly framed as something that is incidental, as a always positive byproduct of peacekeepers' activities. Now, today we see peacekeeping operations turning to a previously unseen type of infrastructure projects, and also I'd say an unprecedented level of ambition. And that is especially in the renewable energy sector. And that's what got me actually into this project in the first place. And so my research is qualitative of nature, I should say. It's based on archival research, document review of what's happening currently, and lots of interviews with practitioners in the field and many professionals within the UN system. And so I was very curious to see how can these new infrastructure projects, when you're seeing here, and I'll be talking about this more, how are these projects understood, especially in the context of climate security and perhaps even environmental peace building? And then more practically, because I'm an urban planner by training, what are the opportunities and also the limits and the risks of such an approach? And here I look at it specifically from this urban planning perspective. And to take away some of the very high level key findings, and here, bear with me, that's a bit perhaps theoretical. I propose that peacekeepers are political and spatial actors, which maybe pushes the boundary a bit of what's humanitarian. And infrastructure is not a incidental byproduct. It is an important tool to pursue ideas of what peace looks like as a society is emerging from war. And so in the end, this is now where it gets us to the climate security nexus. These renewable energy projects, these new big infrastructure projects are currently one of the tangible ways for how the climate security nexus, or this kind of concept of climate security, is implemented in peacekeeping. So very briefly, just like 3 ideas of infrastructure that kind of guide this research. So physical infrastructure, it is technical, it is engineered, it's, peacekeepers do this, but, they have the heavy machinery to do it. It's pipes, it's steel, it's concrete, but it is also very much linked to notions of development, it's a way to exercise power. It is very much a modern idea. Right? If you think of Robert Moses in New York City, it's really about kind of progress of communicating, connection and speed, and really modernization. And so I think we can see this driving even peacekeepers' involvement in infrastructure. They want to develop and through development contribute to peace. Now, what infrastructure studies show us is that infrastructure has not only these kind of positive attributes, but that infrastructure, when you build it, it can also create disruption, marginalization, and violence. And so this is a much more complex view of infrastructure. And so for some of you, this might be should kind of set off the first alarm kind of bells. So you mentioned this already, just kind of very quickly, how bringing this to the aspect of to peacekeeping. In 2011. Peacekeeping was considered, or kind of was stated to be, the largest polluter within the UN system. Very quickly thereafter, we have seen, in the context of greening the blue, also greening the blue helmets, the first report that kind of linked environment and peacekeeping. Then in 2013, a revolution happened within the mandate of MINUSMA when a environmental clause was added to their mandate to take care of the environment. We've seen since then a rapid evolution, I think very much like reflecting what you were mentioning, of like thinking more about the environment in peacekeeping. So the environment strategy for field missions in 2017, and the concept of positive legacy that came up in this context. Then the transition to climate change, the climate security mechanism, we'll be hearing about more. UNSCAP, that is also now a key reference even for peacekeeping. And then in 2022, in a UN Security Council resolution, the first mentioning by the Security Council of the word positive legacy, of the concept. And now what's important is that positive legacy, even in this UN Security Council resolution, is linked to the idea of renewable energy. So there seems to be a particular kind of, let's say, an area of hope where climate security and positive legacy here become tangible through renewable energy projects. Okay, so in practice, how do peacekeepers get their energy? In the African context, or in the missions in Africa, there are currently 3 models of renewable energy in infrastructure. And I should say that the pressing need for renewable energy comes from, amongst other things, the kind of a threat of fuel theft, which is very much an issue within peacekeeping operations. Just like the complicated nature of the logistics of fueling the mission. And then, of course, also everything that has to do with pollution, kind of health issues. So many issues why, like you can say, renewable energy is good to pursue. The three models that we currently see is, on the one hand, the in-house procurement, which is renewable power panels are built within the camp and fuel the camp. So the offices, the kind of the accommodation for peacekeepers. The second one is partnering with local energy providers, which is happening in the Virunga National Park, and some of the energy from the hydro dam there is fueling is kind of provided to some camps of the mission in the DRC. And the third model that we currently see, with exactly one example, is what I'm going to talk about a bit more now, which is also kind of the most, in my mind, to my mind, crazy and ambitious project, is what we see in Baidoa in Somalia, which is building a new renewable power plant, solar plant from scratch, in order to distribute energy to peacekeepers and eventually also to local populations. So what happened precisely? UNSOS, the UN Support Office in Somalia, signed a power purchasing agreement with an international private sector energy developer who finances and builds the power plant and also the grid. And so the UN acts as an anchor client, committing to use this energy that's produced, and then what's left over should be given to or channeled to the local community. And the idea is that 100%, at some point there'll be 100% transition to renewable energies for the entire city of Baidoa. And this means then in return that we don't have like 900,000 liters of fuel being burned per year, which is currently the case through the generators. So really a very ambitious project that I think gave a lot of hope to the UN and to other peacekeeping field in general as a way forward to really kind of pursue sustainable peace, to leave a positive legacy in the long run. Now, some of the ideas that are embedded in this new type of integrated and very long-term infrastructure project. So the idea is a kind of a planning for 15 years until the project will be handed over to the local government. And 15 years is, as you maybe know, much beyond what a peacekeeping mission can plan for. Peacekeeping missions are renewed annually, and while many do stay for a really long time, they cannot make any commitment for such a long time. And so the idea of development that's embedded in this project has been there for a long time. But what is new is, of course, this kind of partnering with the private sector and somewhat formalizing this very long commitment for more than a decade that a project like a power plant and the development of a grid needs. And so I mentioned this before from an urban planning perspective. That means that peace operations really embed themselves into the local development, into local development strategies, here in this particular case through electrification. And that's beyond their mandate. It is a way for them to foster sustainable peace. And that's, I think, where we can discuss a bit, okay, what should sustainable peace look like? But it's still, of course, because it's a military actor, and sometimes we tend to forget that, they also still have very much, of course, an interest in security and kind of thinking through everything with this military focus. And so that means that for now, the power plant is built within the green zone. And even the grid so far has been developed only within the green zone. And so that does provide electricity to some government buildings or to some hospital, but certainly not yet to anything else beyond that green, very militarized zone. So thinking about the local population, the residents of Baidoa, well, so far, of course, they have not been integrated into that grid. And of course, also the question becomes then, how will this develop in the future? If we have this kind of hub there, how will the electrification of Baidoa look like in the long run? Should the UN actually have a say in determining the development? So before closing, raising these critical aspects of looking at the militarization, the kind of the strategic choices that are made in the development of the grid, of where to place the power plant. This is not meant to dismiss the UN efforts at contributing to climate mitigation. And there are many positive benefits of why the UN wants to move away from generators that are leaking, that are difficult to replace, all of that. But I think we also need to draw attention to the possible equity and sustainability concerns that come with such a project. So concretely, I think there are a few questions that we need to ask, and that I think because infrastructure has been seen as something, as this positive byproduct, I think the UN has not really been engaging with. So the question I would ask, and this is maybe more where it gets more to the practitioners, is how much does a project like building a renewable power plant, how does it cater to local, immediate and long-term needs, to different population groups? So thinking about the newcomers to the city, rural populations, to different class, gender, ethnicity, tribal affiliation, and how do they benefit or can benefit from such a new energy infrastructure, and which groups might be further marginalized. So in other words, what does it actually take for you to be connected to the grid? Who will be able to connect to the grid? And who makes these decisions? Put differently, and this relates back to what we learned about kind of infrastructure theory, is like what new divisions might such a project actually create? And I think that's where what has been lost a bit so far in the debate on renewable energy. And so another question, and I'll end here, is like also thinking about the future of such ambitious and complicated infrastructure projects when humanitarian actors or peacekeeping in this case leave. So are the capacities there, are the spare parts very practically there to maintain and to operate and to repair the infrastructure after the anchor client UN leaves? And then perhaps more broadly, I think, and that's really up for discussion, is to think of like, are peacekeeping operations really the right actor to do such a project, to build that infrastructure, and also to make the urban planning decision that come with this. That is, where to go, where should the grid go, etc. So this is, I'm ending with a lot of questions, I realize, but I think it's really just the kind of we're at this inflection point right now where peacekeeping is doing this work and experimenting with it, but I think it's also many things that have to still be kind of grappled with, and that's where we are. So I'm just ending here.
Thank you, Silvia. That was extremely interesting and lots of food for thought. And really kind of emphasizing the point of seeing infrastructure as a key part of a kind of sustainable vision for sustainable peace, with all its benefits and unintended consequences as well. Does anyone have any immediate need for clarifications? Yes.
I swear it's an actual technical question on this. I was just wondering, you said that this infrastructure would basically be then handed over sooner or later to those communities. Is there any sort of mechanism involved to pay for the upkeep of this infrastructure, or is it basically just, here you go, good luck?
Well, that's because it's in 15 years. So it's really just, it's like it finished construction this year or last year. So it's just really the first month of operation. I think at some point the idea that in 15 years, there's like so much capacity building between now and then that this can be just like, But maybe that's also, if it in these 15 years' time, maybe too,
because capacity is not financing.
Yeah. And I mean, then it would be just like any other private sector project, or
Great. So maybe hold your questions and no, but that was good point to clarify. But we'll move on to the second presentation by Meryam Bouhati. Meryam is a PhD candidate in political science at the Center for Political and Social Research at Lille University. And a dissertation focuses on the environmental dimensions of peace, with a specific focus on the connection between water and conflict. And she'll be presenting on how the UN climate security mechanism can mainstream environmental peace building in the security sector and beyond.
Yeah,
Over to you. Thank you.
thank you so much for this presentation. Thank you so much, Sylvia. You already touched on some points that I was going to talk about, so I'm going to skip them, and it's going to be relatively short. So the initial question was, is the climate security mechanism capable of mainstreaming climate security in the UN system and beyond? And the short answer is yes. But this presentation is based on a paper that I wrote after a 3-month long internship at the UN Secretariat in the Department of Peace Operations within the Climate Security Mechanism team. And the objective of this paper was actually to see what the personnel does to the entity and what the entity does to the system, and see how that affects what they do on the ground and how they perceive environmental peace building. So this is a little bit of my on my methodology. So like I said, it was a 3-month internship where I had the opportunity to be at meetings within the UN Security Council, but also between the climate security mechanism and the partners like IOM, member country partners also. I had the opportunity to observe, participate, and also meet and interview some of the CSM team members. So the construction of CSM, well, the climate security mechanism was actually brought to the discussion within the UN Security Council in 2007, by the United Kingdom. And it was later on talked about and discussed by several other countries like Germany, and later on in 2017 by Sweden. And it was Sweden actually who came up with the idea of what they called at first the mini mechanism, because it only had, like you said, Matthew, the Department of Peace the Department of Political Affairs, the DPPA, and UNDP and UNEP, and later on DPO actually became a member. And that's how it became the climate security mechanism as we know it today. So yeah, some of the meetings that led to substantial language addition to some of the UN Security Council meetings and missions. And the CSM is primarily, so like I said, made of the PPA, UNDP, UNEP, and PPO. And it's primarily was meant to create partnerships to mainstream climate security within the UN Security Council through negotiations with member countries to bring the topic to the meetings and create ARIA formulas about climate security and climate security connected issues like high sea level rise in 2022. So yeah, the core team so the core team is responsible of the CSM is responsible for support and field analysis as well, and action, knowledge management, and capacity building efforts. And like I said, the partnerships are really the pivotal part of the endeavors and ambitions of CSM to position themselves as thought leaders and pioneers within the realm of climate security and peace. And in that sense, CSM becomes the more important, not for being an innovative and urgent response to climate change and security imperatives and challenges, but for the alliances that it can create and maintain within and beyond the UN system, as observed in the study of international humanitarian work and aid. So the personnel, well, Each of the entities that make up the CSM is supported by a dedicated team integrated into the foundational structure of CSM. And at the apex, of course, there is the Joint Steering Committee, which is made of high-level directors, so D2 for those who know the UN system, and a team leader for each for each department and organization. And along with these principals and experts forming a team for the member state partners. So yeah, the UN Security Council is considered to be a member of sorts of the CSM, but also a partner. And in conjunction with the committee, there is the core team that is consisting of focal points. I don't know if you can see it. So there are focal points under each organization, the 4 organizations. JPOs for the most part, and interns. And I was an intern, so I put myself in there.
To the UN.
Yeah. So this, of course, has changed. There was a lot of movement when I left. I have to say that I did this internship from 2022, like November 2022 to February 2023. So a lot of people moved on to different positions within the UN system. So the CSM team as an all, if we add in the hierarchy, the higher up people, is made up of about 20 individuals. But the core team, however, is made of 10 permanent and semi-permanent team members. I didn't count the interns and the semi-permanent ones. So I'm interested in the personnel because it tells a lot about how the UN perceives climate security. Upon closer examination of the academic journeys and professional journeys of team members, a minimum of 50% of these people have pursued studies in international relations and international affairs, and this includes specializations in related disciplines such as African studies, international cooperation, humanitarian aid, all considered integral to the field of international affairs and relations. And within this 50% of people, only one individual has concentrated on international security. No, okay, sorry, I got messed up. 50%, one individual has concentrated on international security with a specialization in international conflict resolution. 10% of team members possess a law degree. And only one has a master's in sustainable development or a climate-linked element. And it really focused on agriculture. So another team member brought expertise in environmental engineering. Importantly, all team members have completed their education abroad. So the inclusion of team members with a background of peacekeeping and counterterrorism reflects also the importance of security aspects of the climate security. And this expertise can contribute valuable insights into understanding the potential security ramifications arising from climate-related conflicts and their implication for peacekeeping efforts. But it does not advance knowledge on the climate aspect of climate security, climate change effects on security. So, but a concentration, well, okay, so despite an apparent diversity, all of these team members came from OECD countries also, which I'm gonna talk about later. But there is and was a homogeneity in expertise, which of course limits the diversity of perspectives when it comes to the approaches of climate security within the team. And the scarcity of team members with backgrounds in environmental studies juxtaposed against the organization's environmental dimensions of climate security raises questions on the possibility of questions around securitization of climate or climatization of security within the UN Security Council. So yeah, and of course this shows that the organization's values and priorities lay in the capacity to draft speeches, policy papers, framework documents, background notes, etc. In order to mainstream. But of course, a noteworthy development within the climate security in the last couple of years was the hiring of advisors and the appointment of advisors, climate security advisors that are, for some of them, specialized in natural resources management and other disciplines linked to climate change and climate environment. So yeah. So what does this do to the institution? First of all, like I said, it raises the question about the predominance of the security dimension of climate security. In their trainings, the CSM also organizes trainings for its for the practitioners on the field. But when most of the people are only specialized in security, well, that's all the talk is going to be about. And there is no deep knowledge on environmental aspects of climate, of the climate effect on security, but a focus on security. The local populations there is an effort to include local populations on the field. However, there are no local population representations on the security, the UN secretarial level. And that's something that should be worked on, because who knows what's going on the local field more than the local communities. And of course, it would be better to have their input at a high level, So one other element is the fact that despite the fact that the climate security mechanism is a new mechanism, it's innovative, there has been no adoption of new instruments to back up this new mechanism. And no reforms, and the CSM itself could be viewed as a reform into the UN system, as it represents an interagency cooperation on a cross-cutting theme, which is climate security and peace. The establishment of the CSM did not change much about the very functioning of the member organizations, UNEP, UNDP, DPPA, and DPO. It actually, so the team members, the core team members continue to work on separate projects within their own organizations, and their time is not fully dedicated to the CSM work. And so it depends, the CSM work really depends on their agendas and the agenda of the organizations involved in the mechanism. And of course, some dynamics of competition continue to prevail, like it does, on funding questions. So yeah. So the CSM was precisely intended to limit the spillover and competition, but it fails to do so in the way it is put into place right now. Yeah, so and another element is that the CSM exhibits a considerable amount of communication, and aside of the training it provides and endless negotiations to mainstream climate security to the UN Security Council and its partners, it lacks substantial action, and the only real change seen is when it comes to language, the language used in language adjustment, which could be mistaken for rebranding. So it like instant, yeah. The inclusion of climate security language and considerations seemed more like embellishments at some events than substantial additions. And in fact, the thematic review of on climate security and peace building in 2023 addressed the tendency to merely append environmental or climate-related components to existing strategies. And several projects incorporated climate security issues in their conflict analysis, but fell short on fully integrating this consideration in the actual project activities. So yeah, to conclude, so this article its main objective was to see how mechanisms like the climate security could change the functioning of not only an organization, but its partner organizations as well. What it showed is that despite the innovative side of the climate security, it reproduced very dynamics that are criticized in international organization work in general. But it raises questions also on the dynamics between security and climate within the climate security reflections. And so some questions must be posed about the potential of climate security mechanisms to actually mainstream securitization of climate, which is an issue within the UN Security Council, but has to be addressed on a more global level. But of course, this is a mechanism that was created in late 2018. So it's in its infancy stages, and it would be more interesting to study it on a longer term to see what kind of evolution it will know and take. So I'll finish on this. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Meryam. I think yeah, your paper comes out at a critical time, as you said. There's been a lot of momentum and the hiring of new personnel at the CSM level, and perhaps now is the time to actually reflect on what has worked, what hasn't worked. Personally, knowing some of the climate security advisors, as we've discussed, I mean, some of them don't actually completely understand what their job is meant to be, which is not necessarily a bad thing, but it's a new field. But so there's opportunities to still shape discourse and narrative. I don't know if you have any immediate points of clarification. If not, we'll move to the third prison.
You're taking questions in the end, right?
Yeah, of course. Yeah. This was just like immediate, but we'll have plenty of time for questions and answers. The third presentation is from Juliane Schillinger, who I believe just earned a PhD last Friday. Congrats.
It was the last session though, like
I think you've
only lived us down afterwards.
You've presented at 4 or 5 different panels, so but yeah, Juliane is from Twente University and is also a technical advisor on climate and conflict at the Red Cross Climate Center. And her work focuses on climate adaptation, disaster risk reduction, and anticipatory action in fragile settings. And she'll be talking about localizing climate security and the future of humanitarian action. Over to you.
Thank you. And I find quite nice that you actually mentioned that sort of the local perspective was missing, because I was like, hey, here I am. So I have to preface this with the fact that I was not supposed to give this presentation. This was supposed to be done by my colleague Sarah, who is unfortunately sick at home. And we have been working on sort of the topic of climate security at the Red Cross together. However, a lot of the actual substantial work that is part of this presentation that I will kind of gloss over a little bit was her work. So I can tell you a lot about sort of our broader reflections. If you have super detailed questions on specific projects we've done, I might point you towards her email address or our website, just as a warning beforehand. So, yeah, localizing climate security. We love talking about localizing in the humanitarian sector, right? So where am I coming from? Matt mentioned the Red Crescent Climate Center, and we're not really part of sort of environmental peace building conversations or climate security conversations a whole lot. So let me just give a little bit of context. We are a so-called global reference center for the IFRC, so the International Federation of Red Cross and Red Crescent Societies. And what that means is that we basically provide support to national societies and the IFRC directly and the ICRC on matters of climate. So whenever they have questions, whenever they want to work on something that integrates climate a little bit better, we basically join them, we support them with technical support, but also just to help link up to some of the climate policy processes. Specifically in the conflict team that we are having, we work a lot with the ICRC, for example, to ensure that their humanitarian interventions are what we call climate smart. So not just greening their operations, we're putting solar panels everywhere, but making sure that they're actually taking into consideration what climate is going to look like over the next 1, 2, 3, 4, 20 years in the locations where they're active. So that, for example, if we're building new infrastructure, maybe we don't build it in an area that is at higher risk of flooding, or building in a way that is just not going to withstand heat waves that we're expecting over the next 10 or 20 years. So a big part of this is really thinking about what are these interactions between climate and conflict in conflict-affected settings where the ICRC is active, but also other organizations. And so in this, a big part of our work is on compounding risks. So compounding risks, what we mean is basically climate risks and conflict risks coming together. And I probably don't have to tell most of you, but basically this interplay of different drivers of vulnerability, of risk, of exposure, basically then gets you into this loop where it just gets worse and worse and worse. So we have populations that are already highly exposed to climate risks. They are then in a conflict setting. They might be displaced, have higher vulnerability to future risks. Those risks might displace them again. And then we have this whole dynamic of where does conflict fit in, where does climate conflict, and I'm putting it in quotation marks, fit in this whole sort of mishmash of different risks. But so why specifically are we now suddenly thinking about climate security? We've been pretty much missing from all of the conversations so far. That's not just us specifically as the Climate Center, but sort of the humanitarian sector. And I think a big part of it is sort of this very security-focused element to it, where we just don't really fit in. We don't really do sort of defense, we don't do sort of traditional security. We definitely don't do, and we had a session on that yesterday, conflict prevention, because that is very far outside of our mandate and brings all kinds of ethical issues. So generally, we're not really part of this. And over the past 1 or 2 years, we've done a little bit of soul searching, and well, some of that has actually happened in The Hague, and some of you were a part of that, to really think about what could be our role as humanitarian actors in these climate security discourses. And there were basically two things that we figured out at some point, that we are actually the ones sort of on the front lines of a lot of these topics. We have all of our national societies, we have a lot of humanitarian workers who are really there. When climate hits, when those tensions might increase, so we have all of these experiences. And to us, what was really missing is this link between those relatively high level, very policy-based climate security discussions and what we're actually experiencing in everyday life and in our regular work. And so one of my colleagues put it very nicely when we were brainstorming a little bit, that in the climate security discourse at large, there are so many assumptions in terms of whatever climate impact is going to lead to conflict that people came up with at some point, and we have all of these assumptions. So what we're trying to do is challenge those assumptions and ideally replace them with evidence, where there's evidence for the assumptions, and also be very, very open about assumptions where there's just no evidence for based on our work. So that's the one part, to really make sure that the local perspective is part of this climate security discourse. And then the other half of it is this kind of tricky topic of conflict prevention that we shouldn't really talk conflict prevention. We had a lot of amazing presentations over the last couple of days on really unpacking this link between climate and conflict, and what does climate security actually mean, and is climate a driver of conflict or not, and sort of what are the specific mechanisms. And quite often, these are in one way or another based on disruptions of livelihoods. They're based on communities not being resilient to climate impacts. And those may then lead to or exacerbate existing tensions. And so we as humanitarians, we're very much in the business of securing livelihoods, of building resilience. So we're already there, raising the question of, well, if we know what is happening in terms of potential conflicts, can our work actually contribute to relieving those potential tensions? And we don't have to call it conflict prevention, we probably shouldn't. But so there might be a role for us here. And so now comes this dreaded part where I have to improvise a little bit. Just to give you a bit of an overview of some of the projects we've been doing recently, just trying to explore this link of climate and security and what it all might mean. So one of the examples I brought that you probably cannot read in detail was some work that we did on Cabo Delgado in Mozambique, which is the one area of Mozambique where the ICRC is actually active. And we were looking at the cyclones Idai and Kenneth back in 2019 to sort of understand how, on the one hand, violence that was already taking place in this area sort of undermined the human security of people in the first place, sort of drove vulnerability to natural hazards like those cyclones in those sort of 2017, 2018. Then in 2019, when the cyclones themselves hit, how they put people at higher risks of violence, for example, because they were displaced over and over and over again. And then people would be displaced first by the cyclone, and then they would be displaced by violence. And so it just kept going like that. And then sort of on the longer term, also seeing what might have been sort of more longer term, and 2 or 3 years is not that long term, but sort of looking at those sort of implications in the aftermath of those cyclones. So what were the disruptions of livelihood, continued displacements, of those kind of things. If you're super interested in that, I put a QR code to the story map that we did on it in the corner, but also if you just look for like Climate Center story map for Mozambique, you might be able to find that. We love story maps because they're sort of very, very nice visual way of presenting information. Of course, a lot of it is being put on maps. So a little bit of the sort of qualitative aspect is, hidden in the text. So you actually have to read it. You can't just scroll through. But it's a pretty nice overview of the sort of interplay of disaster risk and violence and sort of how it goes back and forth. The other part, and that's the really difficult one for me, is sort of very recent work that we've been doing sort of while I was gearing up for the PhD, so I didn't really pay much attention to it, is work that we have done with regards to like actually explicitly climate security risks. So it was the first project we had that sort of really said climate security in the project title, that are related to El Nino. And basically what we were trying to do was sort of untangling different storylines of sort of how El Nino might have undermined livelihoods, how it might have led to tensions, and then in a step further to figure out how might we be able to minimize climate security risks by having sort of different adaptation strategies by bringing in disaster risk reduction activities in those areas. And so there's going to be a very nice spaghetti graph, as I like to call them, coming. You can't read the details, which is probably for the better because I'm not 100% sure if this is public yet. But so just to give you an idea of like the messiness of it. Please don't take photos of it. So this is, yeah, it's still work in progress, but basically, so what we're trying to do is sort of looking at what are the different sort of hydrometeorological drivers, what are more socioeconomic drivers, where does existing conflict or existing instability fit in, and sort of how does this all link? And you can see, as I said, it's messy, because real life is very messy. And there's no just one driver that leads to everything. So again, the plan here then is to really figure out what are those, maybe those pinch points. What are elements that we can actually try to design climate adaptation for that will strengthen communities and that will minimize the risk of tensions. So that was that very, very quickly because I don't know more about it. So what's next? I feel like the slide should have like a tiny text, like this slide intentionally left blank as you have an ebook sometimes, because that's really what we're trying to figure out right now. Where do we fit in? We have this perspective that we can contribute, and we've started sort of talking to some different actors that have already been in the climate security discourse for quite a while. But really part of coming to this conference and sort of presenting the little bit of what we've been doing so far and mostly our thinking on it was to figure out who else wants to talk to us. Sort of what is our role, what could our role be? And I think I will just leave that open for ideas, discussions, and just leave it there.
Great. Thanks, Juliane. But yeah, now we have about 40 minutes for questions.
Very efficient.
Very efficient.
Like every time they said, hey, we're going to keep it short and then we will have a lot of time for discussion. And it's 5 minutes to the break.
No, do we? When's the
No, it's not.
Oh, no, okay.
You're better than all the other sessions.
Right, yeah, finished. So we have one here. Shall we take maybe 3 to begin with? No, so yeah.
Yeah. Conflict sensitivity, very, very, very big topic, and we're doing it very, very badly, if we're doing it at all. One of the issues that I'm seeing, because we started sort of pushing, and I was especially sort of in the context of anticipatory action, but just also broadly, so from Clemens side, we are pushing a lot more for conflict sensitivity, and like I was actually kind of part of that at one point as well. One of the big problems I'm seeing is that a lot of different organizations, and whether it's only humanitarian organizations or generally organizations, have interesting definitions of what conflict sensitivity means. And so we're talking to them about, oh, you know, are you doing conflict sensitive program? And they're like, yeah, we're taking into consideration sort of the logistical challenges of operating in conflict settings. That's not what it means. And so we're trying to get them to think about it, and so to just sort of even provide those basic tools of like, how do I run a proper conflict analysis? How do I even start sort of being aware of sort of this setting that I'm working in, and sort of what kind of implications my presence here might have? It's been quite an uphill battle, part of that because for some reason people got very, very comfortable with different sort of terminologies. So, you know, you first need to go in and tell them, hey, actually what you've been doing is not what you think you've been doing. And then here's how you should do it instead. And sort of they might immediately already be insulted and stop listening to you because you told them you're doing a job wrong. So it's something that I think we really, really need to work on more. And that is on sort of those more early warning, early action kind of things, but also with regards to climate adaptation. And I think that's the other part of what you mentioned in terms of like humanitarian actors coming in with this sort of very short-term perspective, where I think luckily now we see more people in the humanitarian sector actually starting to really think about this in terms of like, we're not really in the short-term business anymore necessarily. Like we see, especially in conflict settings, we see there's more protected conflicts. We see the entirety of climate change. We're not really doing only short-term emergency where we're in and out anymore. But we are there for long times, and then we need to be conflict sensitive, and we need to think about how we actually fit into this whole universe of different actors, of different cultural elements that are already in place, and how we fit into climate adaptation strategies, which is something humanitarians hadn't really have to think about before. And so that's a lot of the work that we're doing with the ICRC, for example, to say, hey, if there's already climate strategies in place, maybe see that you can actually add to that rather than just do your own thing. So that's that part. I very much feel for you with regards to funding, because like I see a lot of funding going away as well. Maybe at some point we will meet on the same level of funding, the way it's going internationally. Yeah, with regards to the ICRC delegation on climate security, it's a very ICRC delegation declaration. With, you know, there is no direct link. There might be something, maybe. So it's a relatively broad, I want to say non-committal declaration, because it has to be, just in the way the ICRC works and the sort of the way it has to position itself. So it helps in the sense that it is sort of formally on the agenda, and we can use it as sort of a bit of a leverage point when talking to other movement partners, to just say, hey, you know, the ICRC is thinking about this, we should as well, probably.
I meant, sorry, the COP28.
The COP,
yeah,
because ICRC has a. Yeah, so for COP, like the peace declaration, we're looking into it more. Of course, the main thing is, you know, finance. Finance is great, but where does the finance go? As long as it goes only to governments, especially in conflict settings, it's going to stay tricky. And so actually, we have an online event coming up, like I think in 2 weeks, that talks about sort of the role of the peace declaration for anticipatory action in those settings. If anybody wants to join, let me know afterwards. Yeah, but I think it's an ongoing process, and some of it sort of happens a little bit more in the policy realm. Like, I'm a very technical person, so I would have to basically send you to some of our policy experts for that. Coordination with other humanitarian organizations, yes and no. I think it's not so much specifically on climate security, because everybody is still a little bit hesitant to touch the term. But sort of underneath the surface, I think there is a lot of sort of trying to coordinate. And I think a lot of that is unfortunately happening on sort of a little bit of a higher level, because of once you go to the local level in the humanitarian sector, everybody is so incredibly preoccupied with their own work and sort of all of the catastrophes and all of the fires they're constantly putting out, which is also a little bit where we're trying to come in as the sort of support to help them do all of this coordination that they're currently just not able to do, or just don't have the capacity to do. And then on anticipatory action, I feel like at some point you might have to cut me off, because I could do an entire session on that, because we are actually chairing the working group on anticipatory action in conflict settings within the Anticipation Hub. So that really looks at, on the one hand, how do I do anticipatory action in conflict settings, which goes back to, please do it in a conflict sensitive way, for heaven's sake, and also all of the logistical challenges. But then the other side of it is sort of this whole anticipatory action for impacts of conflict, and to really look at the elements of how might a conflict sort of undermine resilience again, or sort of increase vulnerability, and taking into account all of these elements when designing anticipatory action frameworks. And I will leave it there, so the others have a little bit of time as well, but we can absolutely chat about that later as well.
And then maybe if you wanted to answer to the question about language.
Yeah. Thank you so much for the question. I was wondering the same thing when I got to the CSM in the first place. Like, if the security side of climate security poses so much problem, why don't they change it? But I think it's related to the nature of the climate security mechanism, because one of their main priorities is to mainstream climate security into the UN Security Council, and push towards the change of language and the mandates and in the missions and everything that goes with that. And that's possibly why the security aspect is so important. But in their activities, at least when I was there, they would make an effort to put peace into climate security. So it would usually be about climate security and peace in informal meetings or in other types of activities. So hope I answered your question.
So, anything cool?
No, I'm just like thinking now from what you said. I mean, I think this language thing, I think, has real implications on the ground, right? And I mean, security and peace is not the same thing. And if you look at security studies, I think there's like some people here in the audience that can speak to this more. But I mean, you know, these are very distinct concepts, and I think there's a big risk of like equalizing or trying to substitute security for peace, or you know. So I'm not sure this is actually even the right approach to go this way.
And again, the element of funding, I think, is pretty key in terms of dictating.
Yeah, of course.
Yeah. Okay, next round of questions. I think we had one here. And then there. Okay, we'll do.
I think like just like maybe I can go from there to there. I think with the silo busting, I think it's because you mentioned infrastructure. I think it is possible for like the, let's say, civilian folks in the mission to talk more to the engineers and practitioners. And I think it's not done enough, but I think there's actually a low barrier for doing these conversations, and to say, well, like if we want to, you know, we want to extend our peacekeeping camp, can we do this with like local architecture, for example? You know, there have been attempts at doing this, and then they usually get kind of shut up, like down as because of like security risks or something like this, where I think there could be a bit more. Actually, there's actually very like hands-on room for doing something at the local level, which could, you know, look like silo busting, or actually might be silo busting. But more, I think you're raising a really important point. And yes, there are several missions that are kind of about to close, or you know, will be closing soon, likely. And there's been the UN transitions team that has been thinking about this for a long time, and it's transitioning peacekeeping to some other form of UN presence. But I think in the last years, there's also been a kind of realization that there's a material footprint of a mission that we kind of need to take seriously. And that is about like doing environmental assessments as the mission is closing, to look for pollution, for waste that is, you know, and kind of how to just dissolve all the material stuff and where to put it as the mission is closing. Now, you asked if are there positive examples. Personally, I've only been studying in more detail the planning process for the closure of UNAMID in Darfur, which unfortunately, despite I think very good intentions of like handing over entire camps to the community, has been going quite wrong. And I mean, not even talking about what's happening, you know, these days in Sudan. But so while there has been good intentions, not really good results, I think the urgency is there, because we have all these super camps, these like gigantic camps in several missions these days, especially in Africa. And I think I think there's like two ways to look at this. You can say, well, we have these camps, they remain for a long time. So we look at not only like tents, but really, well, in part prefab buildings, but also some really concrete infrastructure that's there within a pretty good standard, which could be amenable to be transformed into university campuses, hospitals, things like that. At the same time, what makes me doubt a bit like this approach, what I think has been discussed as a potential kind of solution for this, is that this is really large scale infrastructure, and it might be actually too big to be managed, because the UN keeping missions these days have the tendency to have like really gigantic camps, and they're a bit too big, I think, to handle. And so if you look at it from a planning perspective, you would say, well, like organic growth, participatory, slow planning, that's like what's good practice. And of course, that's not happening in a context of rush. So I'm not sure it's actually possible to do kind of a good handover. I don't know. I think maybe you have discussions right now in South Sudan that, like, you know,
it's quite big. And I remember recently they did. I think they're just trying to figure out if the government would be able to just run the power supply and just maintaining the power only within the compound would be possible to do. And so this is why internally there's those discussions that are happening. Is in the event that we have to do things over this how the structures are in good condition that they could be used, and yeah, for using it for a university would be great. But also the idea would be to hand it over to the government or the community, but the capacity and just resources to run it completely not there.
And I think it's also a process that needs to be done in consultation with the community.
For sure.
Because you need them to be, once you leave, like what happened in Darfur is like the next day after like this festive handover ceremony, everything was looted, right? And people were just like carrying out anything they could on their backs. So it seems also there is not the willingness of the community to keep it as like a one whole. But I'm happy to talk in more what you're doing these days.
Yeah, thank you for all the questions. They're super interesting. And thank you for the clarification about climate, peace, and security. When I left, they just started including peace. About age, gender, I think it should be tailored to the context in which you are trying to include, but that's my personal theoretical point of view, that every single intervention on any element should be tailored to the context in which it is implemented. I know someone, I work on water management in Lebanon. I know a UNICEF person who was a WASH and peace building and officer. She's no longer there, but she had a lot of trouble working both on WASH and peace building because the situation didn't make it easy. And so I think there is no one big solution, I suppose. At least I don't have the answer, because that would be too easy to say, well, this is how you should do it. But I truly believe that it should be tailored to the context, and this is where local community involvement is important, because they have the insight on what's going on and what the needs are and how it could be put into place. And I think that's an idea, and I don't know how it translates to the practice.
No, I was actually talking about just the context of CFM.
That's a good question. Again, I think it's not you shouldn't be the ones trying to get into the CSM. The CSM should be the one that opens access to more specific practitioners who are on the ground. They're trying to do that with their trainings. But again, maybe it's on the way. We'll see what time it goes. But also to answer your local communities question. Yeah, well, I think it's complicated. I have a whole paragraph that talks about how local community involvement is such a mystery for the UN system. Everyone talks about it, nobody knows how to implement it. I think it starts with the smallest things, like internships at the UN organizations are unpaid, and they're out of reach for people from outside of OECD countries. Even in OECD countries, it is quite complicated. And so it's a really exclusive club, the UN, that is not yet open for people coming from outside of rich countries. It's starting now because of the hybrid internship options. You can have a remote internship, but one of the ways to infiltrate, if you would, the UN system is to intern there, and then you get opportunities afterwards. But yeah, I think we could start. That's the easiest thing to do. Pay your interns and help them with accommodation. Seriously, the UN Secretariat is in New York. The other one's in Geneva. Those are so expensive cities that, yeah. So yeah, that's just me. I'm sad. Yeah, I can't remember the other questions.
Your question, but
If I have the answers to all of them. I think the CSM was created quite early, like in the CSM realm, like in the time security realm. It's still quite new. Like I said, it's in an infant in the realm of mechanisms linked to environmental peace building. Yeah, I think it has a potential to do great things, but it will definitely make a lot of mistakes and learn from them. They're at this point in time, they have no lessons learned from any of their activities, and they're in the process of doing it. So I think we should wait a little bit before we.
I guess how well integrated, because you said they don't have specific climate expertise. So how much are they interacting with other, like, because there's sustainable development lessons to be learned, and then, you know, from other mainstreaming efforts as well.
Yeah, well, they work really closely with UNICRI and CIPRI, who do research on climate change and environment and the environmental security aspect of things. There is UNEP inside the CSM. So their coordination is still at its infancy as well, but they're working on it. So
Great, so I think we have the time for a last round of questions.
There was one question on the HDP Nexus that I haven't covered.
Shall we maybe keep that and then
Yeah.
finish there? So you, okay. Yeah, okay.
Hi, thanks. My name